This episode of The Recovery Couch is brought to you by True Story Media, where real stories find their voice. Whether it's podcasting, video production, or publishing powerful testimonies, True Story Media exists to help people share messages that matter. If you've got a story of transformation, faith, or recovery, True Story Media will help you tell it with excellence and impact. You can learn more about True Story Media at www.recoverycouch.com so you can start telling your true story today. Hey guys, welcome back to the Recovery Couch. So excited for today's episode because today's guest is a powerful voice for truth, life, and redemption. Jordan Daugherty is a 22-year-old birth mom, a passionate Christian, and a bold pro-life and adoption advocate. At just 21 years old, Jordan found herself in a place many can relate to, but few people talk about. Pregnant, alone, broken, and stuck in a lifestyle that did not reflect who God created her to be. But it was at that point that she cried out to Jesus, and in His mercy, He met her there. What followed was a deep, painful, beautiful process of Jordan's surrender, where Jesus began to strip away everything that wasn't from Him, the shame, the fear, the lies, and He started to rebuild her life with truth, grace, and purpose. Today, Jordan stands not just as a survivor of that season, but as a testimony to God's healing power. She's here to share her story. It's raw, it's real, and it's redemptive, and to encourage anyone who feels like they've gone too far or fallen too hard to know that there's still hope. Jordan, welcome to the Recovery Couch. It's an honor to have you here.
Oh my gosh, thank you for having me. I'm so excited, and that introduction was amazing. Thank you for introducing me. God has really done some amazing things, and I'm so excited to be able to talk and share about it.
There's so many human beings that are afraid to talk about their failures, things that have brought them shame, things that have brought them guilt. And that fear, I believe, is stopping them from operating out of their freest, truest self. And that's what I love about your story, Jordan, is you recognized at an early age. How did you overcome that fear of being like, hey, there might be some guilt, some shame from the way I was living, but you know what? I'm not going to let that stop me, because that's one of the most amazing things that I took.
No, thank you. Yeah, I definitely believe, like, even during my pregnancy, I fought with a lot of that. And now post-placement, there's still a lot of, fear sometimes. And do people still judge me? Do people look at me like I'm crazy? And there was at one point in time where I feel like I just woke up and I was like, this was in my pregnancy. And I was like, why am I so worried about what the world says about me, what they think about me, what they care about me? Because at the end of the day, we all die, we all go to heaven, and then we're face to face with God and taking account for our life to Him and how we lived for Him, not for everyone else in the world. And when I could finally resonate that with myself and just be like, Jordan, what are you doing? I was able to sit there and tell myself, I live for an audience of one. And when you live by that, the shame, the guilt, the fear slowly starts to trickle away, because none of that comes from God. God doesn't condemn us. God doesn't shame us. God isn't angry at us. He wants the best for us, and He's going to show His love to us in different ways, but there's no sin that comes from God. And those feelings are of the world. And, that will be all taken away. And when I kind of was able to step back and separate that, I was able to see a difference in my life and not caring as much for what other people had to say, or if, someone was going to judge how I was living, or that I changed and they didn't like that, or that I was pregnant by myself without a ring on my hand because I wasn't married. everyone in this world is going to have an opinion, have something to say. They want to call it their own truth. But I'm choosing to live in a path where there's only one truth, and that's Jesus. And once you can kind of navigate that, that's where the chains of fear and guilt and shame of the world will start to just break off. And, so many people experience that. I know a lot of young girls do. I'm sure men do too. And it's really hard. And I mean, I'm still human. I still struggle with it. And I will always struggle with it because we live in a sinful world. And, but kind of submitting that to God each day when you wake up, it's like, I'm living for you, only for you. I'm not here to please the world or anyone else around me. I'm here to honor and obey you. And it kind of starts to shift your perspective a little bit.
So I took some really good stuff away from what you just said. What does the world think about us? Who cares? Who cares? We live for an audience of one. I love that quote, Jordan. God doesn't condemn us. God doesn't shame us. And there's only one truth, and that's Jesus. So I'm assuming, and I hate to assume, but you weren't living out of these truths. You weren't living out of these understanding at a certain point in your life. The world tempts us into feeding our flesh. Like there's a lot of things that we desire. My first desires were, drinking and weed, my virginity. Those were the first desires of my young life when I was 16, 17, 18 years old.
Yeah.
How did the world get to you? And at what age did you start pursuing the appetite of your flesh?
Yeah. It's so hard to when I talk about this because I grew up in an amazing home, Christian parents, that raised me with love and, taught me about Jesus, went to church every Sunday. And I did live in a bit of a bubble growing up. And so I went to a Christian school and, I wasn't really exposed to a lot. And so when I went to hair school, and even a little bit before that, right before COVID happened, I was enrolled in community college, doing half of my high school there and then finishing some of my college to get college credits. And I was around a lot of different people. I was around older people. I got my first boyfriend. I had never had a boyfriend before. I was around a lot of older girls that wanted to go out and party, especially when I entered hair school. And when I went into hair school, I was only 17. And I was around girls that were any age between 22 and 34. And I was very young compared to that. I had not experienced life like they had. And I started to open a lot of doors that had never been opened before. I, took one drink and I didn't want to stop. I went to a club and I wanted to go back every weekend. I got new outfits to look like them, and I didn't want to stop doing that. And I started using different language, and then I didn't know how to stop doing it because it became a pattern for me. I started getting attention from guys and wanting to have sex, and then that became a door that was very hard to close. And so I just kept kind of rolling down this path of fun, let's have fun, let's do this. Why does it matter? I'm making money now. I have a great career. I can get the guys, I can make the friends, I can get into any place, it doesn't matter. And it just kept spiraling from there, and one thing after another, I slowly started to put my guard down to how people can be evil sometimes. And ultimately, that led me to get into a pretty abusive, toxic relationship that caused me to spiral even more after that. That broke me. And then I kind of used that pain and just poured it into just being crazy. I couldn't tell you at all when I thought about Jesus in that time. I hadn't gone to church in maybe 4 years, hadn't opened my Bible, didn't pray. But if people came up to me and asked me, I'd be like, yeah, I'm a Christian. And that is one of the most embarrassing things that I stand by, is that I sat there and my character in that moment was how I was reflecting Jesus to other people. And that was embarrassing because that is not how God should be displayed and honored and reflected. And I sat there and was a hypocrite in that sense. And I just continued to spiral and spiral, and I turned 21 and I got to spiral even more. And meeting new people, having new friends that just kept pushing me, pushing me, pushing me. And leading up to my pregnancy is when it started to get probably the worst. The drinking, drugs, men. It was, there's some times that I don't really even know where I was. Wasn't getting home until 7 or 8 the next morning, staying up, doing stuff all night, meeting a new guy every night. It was dark and not honoring to the Lord whatsoever. And ultimately, then I met someone later down that road and found myself pregnant. And so I look at it sometimes and really see that that day that I saw that pregnancy test instantly changed my life, like instantly. Because I truly believe that if I wouldn't have flipped over that test that day and saw that it was positive, I would have fallen off that cliff and probably never made it back up. Not really sure where I'd be, what I'd be doing, if I'd still even be here. It The drastic shift was incredible, at least for the physical aspect of living. I still hadn't given my life back to Jesus, just knowing that I was pregnant. But that the drinking, the drugs, I was like, I'm pregnant. I can't do that now. I didn't know what to do with myself, honestly, because I loved the lifestyle that I was living. Did it fulfill me? No, but it gave me that adrenaline rush. Let me get through the day. Like, let me just get through so I can do my makeup, do my hair, put on a hot outfit, and go out and have fun. I lived for that high. And I didn't know what to do with myself when I couldn't do that anymore.
Well, I think, Jordan, it's intoxicating. I think that's why it's so common, and that's why you ran into so many people that introduced you to it. And it's not their fault, but at the same time, getting attention from people and people being attracted to you, that's intoxicating, not just for Jordan, not for Brand, for everybody, And this is where the darkness of the world we live in can present itself as something gold and shiny. And I think there's a lot of people that fall into the trap. That's why I love that you're being honest about it, because so many people fall into that trap and then they don't end up being a voice about it, like, hey, the world got me. I grew up in a Christian home, went to a Christian school. I love Jesus. I was praising the Lord. I did the same thing. I mean, this was part of my childhood too. And then I got to a certain age where the world started tempting me. That really, more than it shows your weakness or my weakness, it shows how strong the dark forces of this world really are. And then you can compare and contrast them to the light, to God. That spirit-led moment you have when you're in praise and worship and your hands are up, and that is ultimate. I think you would agree, right?
Yeah.
That to the way that the darkness presents itself to us in this nice little bowed up present that looks gold and shiny, the feelings aren't that, they're pretty similar, So the darkness knows what it's doing when it tempts us. And I would just hope that you offer yourself grace. And I think that's the beautiful part of your story is you find out you're pregnant. And then take us through what's going through your mind at that point, if you're dealing with any shame or guilt. And at what point did you start to be like, if God forgives me, I have to forgive myself?
Yeah. Those feelings are like, I have no words for that, honestly. The second that I flipped over that test, found out I was pregnant, there was like a sense of, honestly, like denial. I didn't believe it. I didn't want to believe it. And I was just in shock. I was scared to tell anybody.
Probably didn't want to tell your parents, I'm guessing.
Yeah, um, not at all. I was terrified to tell my parents. And, few weeks went by, family knew, friends started to know. I was embarrassed, more so, that I had gotten pregnant, and that I wasn't married and still figuring out my life. there's a lot of things that I was looking at. And I mean, for the beginning part, it was really easy to hide. And so it wasn't something I ever had to lead with, at least for the beginning, because you couldn't tell. Later down the road, that obviously shifted. But I remember going to my first doctor's appointment, realizing that this was real, that I wasn't in a bad dream or something. Um, and about a week after that doctor's appointment, I started having just like weird feelings like I'm about to be responsible for another human being's life. And I just kept kind of replaying that in my head. And one morning I woke up and I was just scrolling through social media, and one of the same videos kept popping up on like 3 different apps that I was scrolling through. And the video was of Madison Pruitt Trout, and it was basically her getting interviewed, basically kind of sharing, um, when we all die, we take account for our lives. And do you want God to be like, no, like you, like I don't know you, like depart from me? Or, do you want him to have his arms wide open and be like, I'm so proud of you, like, welcome home?
This episode is sponsored by Greg Swartz at Remax Victory and Affiliates. Whether you're buying your first home, selling, or making a move, Greg brings integrity, expertise, and heart to every step of the journey. He's not just a realtor, he's a trusted guide who puts your needs first. Call Greg today at 937-477-8975 and let him help you find your next home. And don't forget to tell him the Recovery Couch sent you.
And I just kept like sitting there replaying that thought in my head. And I was like, why would God accept me for the way that I've been living? And in that moment, I questioned my faith. I questioned, if I were to die in that moment, would I be going to heaven? And I wrestled with that really hard all day and wasn't really sure what to do about it. I was like, do I just say like a prayer again? Do I like, need to go tell somebody? I didn't know what to do. And I just remember kept crying because I was like, I really hope the Lord doesn't let me die within these next 24 hours, because I don't think I would be going to heaven. And I ended up reaching out. I know, it's so crazy. Everyone
I
always
hope you
laughs at
don't
me when
take
I
me.
share
Don't take me yet.
that. I know my mom hates it when I talk about that because she's like, don't say that. But I truly do stand by the fact that, I don't think my faith was real. And I believed in Jesus. I knew who Jesus was. But in those parts of my life, he wasn't my savior. I wasn't living like he was my savior. I was kind of living like he was just something I knew about. And I wasn't living for him or living to have a relationship with him. And so I called my pastor, my senior pastor at the church that I grew up in. So he has known me since I was probably like 2 or 3, and has watched me grow up. And I called him and his wife and was like, can I come over? I need to talk to you guys about something. And I showed up on his doorstep to tell them that I was pregnant and asking them what to do with my, like, how I need to fix my life. It was a very hard conversation for me. I wanted to avoid the topic for about an hour into our dinner. And finally, they just looked at me and they're like, so, what's going on? And I was like, I'm pregnant. And, there was a sense of shock from them, but there was a sense of love and grace. And I couldn't have asked for a better response from them.
So you're sitting there thinking like, man, I'm embarrassed being pregnant out of wedlock. It sounds like that's where you started to mature It was like a maturation process, a spiritual
Yeah.
maturation, where you told yourself, I'm about to be responsible for another human being. And then you take this bold and courageous move, Jordan, to where you're like, I need spiritual guidance. And that, I think, to you, I don't know, I hope you've heard this from someone else. If not, you're about to hear it from me. Instead of seeing that moment like, I'm walking to my preachers with my head down. I think you should look at that like one of your boldest, most courageous, one of the bravest things that you could have done. Instead of hiding in shame and fear, you decided like I'm going to go seek spiritual help. I'm going to ask for help. Ask for help. You know how many people have a hard time asking for help?
Yeah.
So, and I didn't want to interrupt, but I just want to
No.
make sure that that's emphasized because I'm so proud of that move from everything I've heard. I'm so proud of that move. I have a similar move in my story, but way to go. So anyway, so took them a while. You say I'm pregnant. They were shocked. And then so I
Yeah,
apologize.
they, you know, we talked about it. I shared kind of the situation, everything revolving around that. Um, and he kind of asked me, he was like, "Do you believe you have salvation?" And I was like, "Uh, I don't know." And he was like, "How many times in the past few years with the ways you've been living, like, have you thought about Jesus?" And I sat there quiet for a couple of seconds and I was like, "None." And I was so embarrassed to say that. And, they continue to love on me and pray for me. And at the end of our conversation, I had shared with them a little bit about my um, leaning towards adoption kind of stance, and that I was going to explore that. I was still very early on in my pregnancy, but so it had just become like something that I had heard about. And they were actually adoptive parents too. And so they were able to pour in a little bit with that with me, which was beautiful. But at the end of that conversation with them that night, I had told him that I was scared to come into church once I started showing because the congregation was a little bit older, very more traditional about things. And I was like, I don't want to get judged. And he said, walk in there with your head held high, and if people judge you, shame on them, because
Mhm.
there's not one person that walks through these doors that is not enwrapped in sin. And
You got a good preacher there.
he is amazing. And I'm
I
so
love
grateful
that.
for him.
I love that.
Um, which is, I also, in that conversation with him, told him that I had been going to another church as well, which beyond grateful for it because one, honestly, that is where my faith grew the most in this past year. That, him and his wife will always be my senior pastors. Like I will forever hold them a place in my heart. And same with that church. But this church that I've experienced now, I've been going there since I was like 9 or 10 weeks pregnant, is what grew my faith incredibly and built my Christian community from the ground up. And so I have two great, church homes, and I will still go back to my old one with my family occasionally. But this one, allowed me to walk in my faith on my own. And I loved that. And he loved that and honored that for me. And they are still very much a part of my life. And I'm so grateful for that. But yeah, I've grown in very different places and had some amazing people pour into me and at just the right moments too. The way God lined it all up was incredible.
Isn't that something? Yeah, I've noticed that in my life too. Like how he's just working, even when you don't think he is, when it seems like it's overbearing or too much. So you use some words, some key words, quite a bit. Embarrassed was one, and then you were worried about judgment, which is where I love the way that your senior pastor handled that conversation. But at the beginning of this conversation, you talked about how God doesn't condemn us, God doesn't shame us.
Mm.
So, at what point do you start shifting your, hey, I'm pregnant out of wedlock. I was kind of living you know, a wild life. I was living a little bit wild, not the way God intended for me to live. But I don't need to be embarrassed about that. Like, I don't need to be ashamed. I don't need to worry about judgment. Where does this shift start to
Mm.
take place?
I feel like it shifted a lot for me middle end of my pregnancy. As I was growing my faith, I was able to learn more and grow more and build my relationship with the Lord more. So where when I felt those things, I gave it to him instead of keeping it burdened on myself. And that came with trusting God, trusting God with my whole heart, and not just leaning on my own understanding. And that came too with reaching out to wise counsel, having mentors pour into me, accountability partners, hey, I'm believing this lie right now. I need you to speak some truth over me. It was a constant fighting it back with the word of God, fighting it back with a prayer, telling that enemy to get behind me because he's not welcome here, and just constantly dying to my flesh each day and letting God guide that instead of letting me lead my own path. And it's always going to be a struggle. But, that shifted for me when I was finally opening my heart to experience the Lord, because God is sitting there waiting for us to open that door. That invitation from him is and will always be there while we're on this earth. And he's just standing there waiting for us to open that door. I had probably had my handle on that door quite a few times over the past couple years. I might have even like cracked it and then shut it again. But for us to receive God, we have to invite him and like take him in. He's not going to place himself on us without us accepting that invitation. And when I was finally able to understand that and shift that, you know, I was able to experience the love of the Lord, the wisdom, the peace. And it takes time, it takes persistency, it takes faith and trust. But, God shows up when you allow him to. And I also experienced some, like, I guess, confusion and a little bit of like anger in the beginning of that, when I felt like I was praying, God, show up for me, God, do this for me, help me through this. A lot of my prayers when I was pregnant were like, God, let me keep my son. And I got fixated on this verse in Mark that would basically state, like, whatever you ask for in prayer, believe you've already received it and you shall. And I would tell myself that verse every day, being like, all right, God, I'm praying for this. I'm believing that it's going to happen. So you better make it happen. And wow, was I so wrong.
That's where you're
Later.
holding onto the door handle, right? Your
Oh,
illustration
yeah.
of cracking the
Yeah.
door. Yeah, I get it.
And I did that. And finally, God just kind of like opened my eyes one day when I was reading and was just like, you know, that verse is very much true. But in the concept of not my own perspective of looking at what I want from my life and how I want to live my life and what I feel like I want, deserve, and need for my life, and then change this perspective to God's will. And if I align my heart with what God's will is for my life, the path he has me going down, the people he wants me to meet, the plan he has for my son, if I shift my humanly sinful mind and selfish desires to God's perfect and holy path for my life, that prayer will always be answered. That prayer will always guide me to the exact thing that I should want and need in my life. And that was a hard concept for me to come around to, because I am a human being that wants to be selfish and to want what I want. And when I finally read that verse now, I love it, because everything that I do know that I pray for and ask for with God's will over my life, I have no doubt that it will happen because God's plan is perfect. And he tells us, I have plans for you. I have a future for you. I have hope for you. Why would I doubt that? Why would I want to choose to live my own lifestyle when that leads to destruction? We're not living for our time here on earth. We're living for our eternity. And that perspective needs to shift. And there's so much joy and hope and comfort in that shift of perspective.
Yeah, I love that. And it sounds like once you started this spiritual maturation process, Jordan, that not only so you talking about God's plan, it seems like God's plan was like, okay, since she wants to mature spiritually, I'm going to allow that. That was probably, one of the first things that he started doing in your life. And then not only did your life begin to shift, but it seems like you had like a relationship shift where you went from, people who were partying to what you have described as wise counsel. And how important has that been in your spiritual walk?
So important. The friends that I had before I was pregnant, and even at the beginning of my pregnancy, they weren't friends. We cling on to people sometimes in the world because it makes us feel good. We experience like this rush of high happiness, excitement, pleasure, all these things. And, people that encourage another person to do something out of sin is not a friend. And that concept, I didn't really understand that. But the second that I became pregnant, it opened my eyes because I basically lost all those friends within seconds of me finding out I was pregnant. And so, I couldn't have fun anymore. I didn't offer anything anymore. And I wasn't like, I didn't, wasn't useful anymore, honestly. And so that opened my eyes to really feel like, what is a friend? I guess I don't have friends. And so during my pregnancy, building that new community at the church that I was sharing about is truly where I was able to grow and find some amazing, amazing women in my life. And that has been such a blessing. And I think that's so important because, like bad character, like in another person that who you're choosing to be your friend with, that's going to reflect then on you. You're going to start pouring into that. You're going to pick up on that. And I wanted, godly women, role models and friends in my life because, at the end of the day, the people that you hang around is what you reflect. And I have that now. I have a beautiful community of women and friends in my life that pour into me, take accountability for me and check in on me, and vice versa. And so God has shown up in the most beautiful ways for that. But if I were to sit here and go hang out all the time with some of those people from my past, of course I'm going to fall back into those temptations. Like I am a human being that is full of sin. And why would I go turn down those things when it's flashing in my face? But I will say on to that it is good to still be friends with the people that, kept me in sin, only because one, like I'm not perfect, they're not perfect, and I'm here to love my neighbor as myself. But, you know, we see in the Bible, especially in the story with Jesus meeting the woman at the well, he sat himself next to the people that were deep in sin, and he poured into them. He offered her the living water. But then at the end, he got up and he left. And so there's a difference in walking with someone that isn't of the wise and occasionally checking in and pouring into somebody, and just sitting with them. And so that's a concept that I've had to change my perspective to, because I want to always, honor people and respect another human being and love them like Jesus loved. But I don't have to walk hand in hand with them in life. I can take a seat with them for a period, and then I can get up and continue walking. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't really fully understand and wrap their head around. Because I think that's drastically important to fully understand, especially when walking in a new life of faith with the Lord, because those temptations will be very hard.
This episode of the Recovery Couch is brought to you by my friend JB Davis at Performance Chrysler Dodge Jeep Ram in Centerville. I know JB personally, and I can tell you he's the real deal. He's honest, he's dependable, and he's committed to treating people the right way. So if you're looking for a vehicle and you want to work with someone you can trust, call JB at 513-267-5225 or stop by Performance Chrysler Dodge Jeep Ram in Centerville and tell them the Recovery Couch sent you. Well, Jordan, you and I were worthy of love even in our darkest days, right? And so were they.
Yeah.
The truth is that they are just the darkness has the people who are still living in their sin, which we all sin, but those still living wildly or feeding their flesh abundantly are just confused. They're still in the trick mode by the enemy. The enemy's got them tricked, and we've been there. So they're worthy of love. But how does somebody who is like me or you, who has fallen to the temptations that they're in, how do we love them, without putting ourselves in a position to fall back into those same temptations that got us? And that's the tricky part. I'm with you on that. So let's get back into your pregnancy though. So you're coming up, your pivotal point. You've built a strong community of prayer warriors and wise counsel who are in your corner. That has to feel rewarding. It has to give you some sort of strength and courage to press forward. And then you got a difficult decision right around the pike. You're about to have this child, and your counsel now is wise counsel. How are you going through this? How as a somebody who's praying to keep their son, but having conversations with their counsel about being a birth mom and the importance of good adoption principles. Walk us through that.
Yeah, that was those months leading up to my due date were incredibly difficult. I really wrestled back and forth with that decision of pursuing adoption, pursuing parenting, constant back and forth. And so I kind of had to start really wrapping my head around it, getting closer towards the end. But one of the months before that, I decided that I wanted to take every single day for the whole month to journal what I felt like God was putting on my heart to help me make this decision, because I didn't know how I was supposed to make that. I don't know how anybody could sit and be like, okay, I need to decide what I'm going to choose for my child for the rest of their life right now. And nobody ever thinks that they're going to be in that position. And so I took every day and I would wake up and I would write, what does my flesh want to do? What does my soul that the Lord is pouring into want to do? And why I feel this way? And what is the best outcome for my son that honors the Lord? And each day I wrote, my flesh wants to keep my son. My spirit that honors God wants to place. And my feelings behind this are, I want to keep my son more than anything. But by placing him in a family unit with a mother and a father that love the Lord and will grow him up in the house of God is what honors God the most. And as much as it doesn't please my flesh and please my heart, I know at the end of the day, it's building the kingdom in heaven. And every single day for 31 days straight, I did that over and over again. And ultimately found myself having deeper conversations with my caseworkers at the agency. And ultimately that led up to picking a family, and getting to meet them. I ended up picking a family about a week and a half before I was due, So I was cutting it real close to the end. Because there was a few bumps in the road with picking the families. And I wanted to meet them before placing my son just to see, you know. And I remember pulling up that day. I can remember everything that I was wearing, how I had my hair, and walking into the place. Because again, whoever places themselves in a position or scenario to think that they're going to be walking in to meet your child's future parents. And I stopped in the middle of the road and started crying. And I was just like, God, I can't do this. Like, I'm not strong enough. I don't have the strength to walk through that door right now. I don't want to do this. Why do I have to do this? And all of a sudden, I get this just rush feeling over me. And in my head, all I hear is like, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And I hadn't heard that verse in forever. And all of a sudden, it just replaying that over and over and over and over in my head. I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. And I opened that door and I walked in and I met them. And God blessed that meeting. God was there in that meeting. There was a sense of peace that truly had no understanding. And it was really hard. I left in tears, but I also left with knowing that God was in that and he was walking with me because I was choosing to walk in obedience. And leading up, obviously, to my due date, I had a planned C-section. And so I knew when I was going to have my son. And so it was a countdown for me, which was a little hard. But I mean, I remember going into that hospital, him coming out and just lifting him up over the table. And I instantly was just like, that's my baby. I had tried to stay emotionally disconnected when I was pregnant because I knew how hard it was going to be. But the second I heard him cry, I bawled my eyes out, because God had created a perfect life inside of me. And it was beautiful. And I got to spend a wonderful 24 hours with my son. And I chose to also hand place my son with the adoptive parents. And it was beautiful. It was the hardest day of my life, but it gave me so much joy to see the light in their eyes and their heart the second that they saw my son. And I will never forget that moment. And I feel grateful to know they have so much love for me and for him. And going home without my baby boy from the hospital was incredibly hard. Obviously, being postpartum is already difficult for women. I had a C-section, so I was recovering from a major surgery. And then also, like, not having my baby. And so I fell into a dark place. I fell into a deep depression, a deep anger with God. And I was fighting for my faith really hard. And there was a sense of like emptiness and longing because I knew I was missing something. I was missing a piece of me. And it was dark and it was frustrating. And I isolated a lot. And a lot of birth moms do that post-placement. Because one, it's not something that anybody can understand unless you've experienced it. I could sit here all day and describe things and give you emotions and feelings that I had, but it is truly a feeling that has no words. And when I meet another birth mom there's almost this like instant connection that the second I hug them or look at them, I know that we've both felt the same thing. And there's this like instant comfort of, I get you. And I didn't feel that with anybody else. I didn't even feel like I could feel that with God. And I was angry. And then I had a moment too where I was reminded about a story in the Bible that is one of the most known stories, but it gets so lost in, I guess, in my head and my heart that certain details about it, I never thought about it the way I did. And now I look at the Bible as an example of anything that somebody's going through in life. There is going to be that somewhere in the Bible. Even if it's just in one sentence, God didn't leave anything out. And there is a birth mom in the Bible. And I didn't know that. I would have never thought that. And I went back and read the story of Moses and how his mom chose to sacrifice raising her son, loving her son for the good, to honor God, to keep him safe and healthy and hopefully happy. She placed him in a basket. I placed my son with a family. And Moses grew up to honor God and walk in such a beautiful display of obedience that changed so many people, saved so many people, and is such a big part of the Old Testament. And you look at his mother, and she is a birth mom that honored God with her decision and built the kingdom of heaven because she chose to sacrifice rather than to choose to please herself. And I connected. I reopened my distance with God, my anger, and reminded myself, like, God knows what I'm feeling. Jesus died up on that cross and felt every single thing that any of us in this world have ever experienced, done, felt. It went over him. It went through him. He felt it all because he came down as a human. And so for me to say, God doesn't understand my pain is so far from the truth. And I had to stop saying that to myself because God gets me. And if no one else in this world can understand me and understand what I've been through, God does. And
And you said that great in the beginning, Jordan, where you said, I live for an audience of one. And to be completely honest with you, you don't have to justify that shit to nobody. I think it's beautiful that you understand the Moses story to the level of that. So often we read scripture and we're focusing on the main character, and there's another character in this scripture that had to let go of her son, or so often, and the prodigal son. I know at my men's group at my church, we've talked about it oftentimes, where it's like, so many people focus on, the son, but what about the father, that just forgave, and there's another piece there. And I think you're absolutely right. Moses's mom, just like you're a modern day Bible story, Jordan, and you're a voice of reason. You're a voice of hope. You're a voice of power. You're a voice of redemption, encouragement. And I'm so honored to have somebody, to be completely honest on this podcast, to be so young in years, but so wise in their understanding. And I hope that encourages you, because it should. I don't know if anybody's ever said you're an old soul. I think that's a huge compliment. Have you ever heard that? Because that's what I gather from you. And it's just incredible to hear all you've been through, and to see how you've grown from a space that was very difficult to this like spiritual maturation that stands before us and sits before us and speaks before us today. So let's tie a bow on that. You feel alone. You're some anger and stuff with God, which I'm glad you said that, because I think everybody's been there. I know I have. And then all of a sudden, another divine appointment here. don't feel like there's any hope at all in dealing. It just sounds like an amazing opportunity to continue to share the voice that God has given you. So, any last things you want to say to the listeners out there? And keep it just for the sake of this podcast, Jordan, if you don't mind. And let me say this. Thank you so much for your boldness, your courage, your bravery, and being honest. We rejoice with the truth on the recovery couch. And and I know that the angels in heaven do too. So we're rejoicing with your honesty and your truth today, Jordan. But any last words for people out there that might still be in darkness, that might be in addiction recovery, or maybe they drink too much, or whatever the case may be? Any encouraging words for them, loving, kind words relative to what you've been through?
The one thing that just comes right to my head is, trust God, He's got you. And I cling to that. I know that God is never going to lead me down a path of sin or destruction. His path is for blessings and for hope and a beautiful future. And trust that and pray His will over your life, because then nothing will ever fail.
Beautifully put. I want to thank you so much for giving us your time and your testimony. I want to remind all the listeners out there, my book, Step 4, will be releasing this fall of 2025. Go and check that out. In the meantime, like, comment, subscribe. We're so grateful to have you here, Jordan, and thank you for stepping in on the Recovery Couch.
Thank you so much.